The SDLC approach is often going to use what we call the waterfall technique or the waterfall model. It's perhaps the oldest and most well-used process for developing applications. The approach is based on a systematic and sequential approach. As I said, we get to one checkpoint, we get to the next one. So it starts, by the way, with the feasibility study, because that's what's driving us to try to reach this new goal, this new business process. From there, it'll transition through requirements, definition, design, and development, then to the implementation and post-implementation. Now, each of these steps, or sometimes called phases, will have defined goals and activities that should be performed at each of these times. And again, that's where I kind of said we have these little checkpoints and stop points. And we'll talk a bit about what these processes are as we go on and talk about the SDLC approach. Now I'm just going to give you the phases that you have in SDLC. Phase 1 is feasibility. Phase 2, as I said, would be the requirements. Phase 3 actually has kind of two parts, the design and selection. Phase 4 has two parts, the development and configuration. Phase 5 is the implementation, and then Phase 6, the post-implementation. Now, one thing you have to think about is that there may be some third-party solutions that can work to fulfill the needs, like with that bus company I was talking about. And if you choose to purchase from a third party, then technically you're going to omit a lot of the steps in the SDLC, probably going right into the selection and implementation phases. Now remember that the SDL phases, that you can, during those phases, you can encounter some things like unanticipated events. And that's an important detail because maybe in the original feasibility you didn't uncover the actual needs or the type of data or the actual model or how they interrelate, and that information is discovered during some of the phases. You might find it's difficult to actually obtain explicit requirements. You might see new requirements from the managers, or customers or users might say, we have some new requirements, as well as changes in the business environment, because it does take time to develop these programs, and some changes in the business environment might have to alter the process that we're going through. And many organizations are going to be migrating to a fully integrated corporate solution instead of perhaps using separate interrelated applications. Those type of solutions are known as ERP solutions. Now, if you think about it, this is a process of saying, I'm buying one program that used to do the job of 6 different programs, but now it's all in one. SAP, an accounting package software, is a good example of where many separate applications were put together. Now, the ERP solution is certainly going to impact the way in which the corporation does business, as well as the entire set of controls that were used, the environment, technology directions, and even the internal resources that are being used. So it's not uncommon in these situations for an organization to have to change its management practices when using such a solution. And due to the size and the type of conversion, it's imperative that management assess and approve all plans and changes when migrating to something like an ERP solution. So let's look at these SDL phases a little bit more. The first one, of course, was the feasibility study. There we're concerned with analyzing the benefits, solutions for an identified problem area. I talked about that already, right? Something drove us, right? Business driver, to know we need something new, something different, something to change. Now, in that, we're going to include the business case, which will restate the strategic benefits or the productivity gains we'll get. We're going to identify and qualify the cost savings, estimate a payback schedule, which you might think of as the return on investment, and any other intangible results, like maybe better morale. People, might right now hate the program you're using and don't like the logic of it, and now you've got this new result, and they might just be like, wow, now my job is so much simpler. The other part of the phase after feasibility was requirements. Now here we're concerned with the identification or identifying and specifying the business requirements of the system that we're going to choose during the feasibility study. Now this should include the descriptions of what that system should do, how the users are going to interact with it, how the system will operate, and the criteria that the system should meet. In other words, we're really kind of laying out a blueprint of what the end product should look like. The next part is the design. Now the design uses what we call the entity relationship diagrams. Now that's an important tool. We call it the ERD. We use it to help create the general preliminary design. Now ERD can be a requirement analysis tool to be able to help getting an understanding of the data and the system needs. If I go back to my bus example, right, I was getting all sorts of information. They wanted to know how many students got on, how long each stop was, and I think the opposite too, right? When they were taking the kids home, how many got off at each stop? I would have thought maybe the same, but I don't know, it could always be different. Anyway, and the idea was for me to figure out how that information, right, was going to interrelate. Trying to understand the data and the system needs is an important part of what we need as a part of the design. Now, ERD can represent a logical data model. It can also help document the actual database schema that we have to create to be able to handle the way in which this data interrelates. Another option we had was software acquisition. Now, it's not technically a step or a phase of the SDLC, as I said. In fact, by acquiring third-party software, we might skip many of those steps. But it is relevant to make sure that we understand that if this is something we've done, which means we've made a choice to purchase software rather than to develop it on our own. And we have to understand the decision criteria. It's often based on factors like the cost, the availability of the software, and the time that would be needed for development and deployment. And really, if you think about it, if the time to develop and deploy is compared, right? If I buy it, I can begin the deployment. If I have to develop it, we have to look and see, how that works with time and cost and availability and all those factors put together. Now, if we go the route of software acquisition, usually it's going to be something we select through responses from vendors with the RFPs we've sent out, the request for proposals. Now, in this case, when we're doing this process, an RFP should be prepared separately for each case of software choice or acquisition. And I know a lot of you are thinking, well, you were talking about the phases of the SDLC life cycle, and I was. And we kind of took a stop for just a minute because we said that one of these options is to purchase the software. Now, it's important to make sure you know that in the CISA exam, the CISA exam, you're going to be asked about the RFP. Well, I don't know if you will be, but you're going to be expected to know about that process. And so it also seems like an appropriate place, since it's a part of the software acquisition, for me to get into a little bit more about the RFP. First of all, when you create, or your company creates an RFP, it needs to contain some minimal information so that companies can adequately respond to your request. Number one, you need to have product versus system requirements. You've got to know what we're looking for. I also want to know, when a vendor responds, what customers they have that can give them a good reference. Obviously, they're not going to tell you about customers that gave them a bad reference. I want to look at the company and know how viable they are. Are they a brand new startup? Are they going to be around for a while, right? So viability and stability. We need to know what is the availability of documentation. It's been a struggle by many different groups trying to get the source code from Microsoft. And by the way, I'm not a proponent that they give it up or that they don't give it up. It doesn't matter to me either way, because I'm going to tell you how we already actually kind of have the source code all on our PCs. But I'll talk about that when we get later on into this particular domain. But we want to know, what kind of documentation do you have on the product? What kind of support are we going to get from the vendor? And what is the availability of source code? That might be useful if we want to add on to this existing package. We should ask in the RFP how many users have experienced their product. Are there any plans to enhance the features, any updates? Because, I'm thinking to myself, if I'm putting out this RFP and you're proposing this solution that next month is going to become version 2, then, I kind of want to know what those plans are, because I may postpone my choice until after I see what you say about version 2. Again, clients, number of clients, and if they've had any acceptance testing of the product. Now, when we're designing an RFP, it's not unusual for us to say, I'm not really sure what the solution is I'm looking for. I mean, I know what the business need is, and but I don't know how to ask the questions or to state, what we really wanted to do. And so it's not unusual for organizations to get help in figuring out what those needs are. And they may submit a request for information to be able to get advice from the same vendors that they're then going to use or send the RFP. Now, you have to understand that especially if I have many vendors, if I'm a large company and I'm sending out a request for proposal, I guarantee you a lot of companies are going to come back with saying why theirs is the best solution. And which is fine. That's what we do. We want to see it. We want that feedback. We want to be able to make a good informed choice. But when we're doing an RFI, we're asking the same people who are going to sell us their solution to help us come up with a solution. So it's important to remember that you're going to get a lot of solutions that are kind of tailor-made for their product. That'll be useful to meet your needs as well. Don't get me wrong there. But we'll probably want to use all that information from all the vendors when we're putting together the RFP. Now, the needs that we have are supposed to be objectively reviewed and subjected to a scoring and ranking methodology so that we can identify which vendor or group of possible vendors might be awarded the contract. Now, that's going to come from the responses to the RFPs. So we're going to look through look at what our needs are. We're going to score and rank them by priority, and then we're going to compare that to what the vendors say they can do as far as meeting those needs. Now, in the event that more than one vendor fits the requirements, then you should ask them to come in and make presentations to provide a demonstration of their product. It'd also be helpful at that point to ask the customers to supply their vendor list, or their list of customers, I should say, so you can contact them and see how that product's working for them.